Thank you, those that send me emails and the like. I really appreciate them. At my age, I keep wondering what's an old fogey doing, but here we go. I want to talk to you about reading. The commonest response I get is people who say to me, and it's a delightful comment, "You changed the way I read completely." That's what I want to do, because so many, especially the young, never get into the joy of reading. It's a chore they have to do, and the pleasure that it can bring to take you into what Auden calls secondary worlds that you've imagined, and other people have imagined, is one of the great joys of being a human as opposed to an animal that has no equivalent. I want to make a comment to begin with that I think you ought all to be thinking about. There is a huge problem growing for ordinary people, particularly in Canada, which is the worst in the world at the moment. Elderly people are going to the doctors and coming back dead. That's not a good idea. And doctors who are angry about this are being pushed. Basically, for instance, in some provinces of Canada now, the family practitioner and the doctor in general are required to raise the issue of medical assistance in dying with elderly people regularly. Well, this is obviously a push from bureaucrats who are so stupid as to think that getting everybody to die a little earlier will be a net win because we spend so much money at the end of our lives on healthcare. But of course, anybody who is involved in saying yes to the death of those they say they love is going to spend the rest of their life feeling guilty about it. That's even worse in terms of productivity. So we need to get to work on this. And I have an idea, and I'll just put it out now and leave it at that for the moment before getting on with what I really want to talk about today. But I think we need to make little buttons that everybody can wear. We ought to get half the population wearing them so that when you go to the doctor, it indicates you do not wish to discuss with them being put to death. In Canada, where MAID is generally the word used, I don't know what word is used in the US yet, it just needs a red line across. And when they ask the question, you just point to your bag and say, please respect. They're always asking for respect for minority groups. Well, they're treating us that way. Let's demand the respect back. We have as much right to be affirmed as anyone else, but certainly they have no right to interfere with our lives, suggesting we're better off dead. So we need to make a little badge, and I think we could get millions of them out there so that when you go to the doctor, you wear it. And if you're aggressive, you'll say, please take note of my badge. I don't want you to talk about doctor-assisted death. So that's my little plug. Somebody out there may be the entrepreneur who knows how to make that work. We need to be coordinated. The real problem with traditional Orthodox small O Christians is that we don't make our views clear enough to other people. All right, let's get back to the podcast. Each year, for a week, for the last 25 years, we run a conference in Ottawa for physicians. And it ought to be much wider than physicians, but we've done it for physicians. Well, there are two reasons why. A, they wanted to be educated the same way we'd educated their children at Augustine College. And secondly, they were being abused in that the accreditation racket that's called bioethics, which is basically being a lapdog to the current liberal powers, was really annoying them because they're required to get CME credits and they go off to a conference that's actually irrelevant to what they do. To add to that has an ethos and a philosophy that they don't accept at all. So we managed to find a way around that so that we could do better than they get at those conferences and get them their credit. And they could enjoy it. So it's been extraordinary. All we did was to take our 8-month program for young people and turn it into an 8-year program done in a week each time. It's like homecoming. They arrive on a Sunday evening. We have an evening service together. We talk and chat afterwards, and then the week starts. And we give 2 lectures a day, that's plenty because they all have a lot of content, and off they go with the people, many of whom are now their friends, because 30% at least of the people who are at the conference have been before and they know other people. They've become real friends. So it's an environment in which doctors who are constantly harassed by the politically correct bureaucracy, worst of all, the HIPAA regulations, Hillary's destruction of real medicine. I don't know how many patients' problems have been solved by a conversation over a coffee or even in an elevator, which is now illegal in the US without specific permission from the patient. It is so ridiculous. So they arrive with us and they know that for the next week they can actually have ordinary human conversations about what is bothering them in their lives, how they could do better, and it's wonderful. The lectures are merely a means. The central thing is that in most people's lives, fellowship is no more than a cup of coffee at the end of a morning service. This is a fellowship that goes much deeper than that. What has really made a difference in your life? What are the real problems we face, etc., etc.? So obviously, at the moment, as the education of our children is being destroyed by the education system, particularly what was done by isolating children from the environment in which their most important education occurs, interaction, play. Our world has gone crazy. The result is currently, or everybody who was there said, yeah, we're seeing an epidemic of anxiety, particularly amongst the girls, less so amongst the boys. Suicide in both groups, but the boys attempted suicide, but the boys are more successful. The boys are dropping out and playing video games. So one lot is destroyed by anxiety and the other by lack of ambition, lack of sense that there's a future for them. What do you do about that? Now, obviously, what you do about that is get rid of phones, iPhones, and start reading and talking. When we arrived in Canada many years ago, my wife, who's very intuitive about these things, realized this was a very different culture. Television had 95 channels, none of which were worth watching. And eating was being turned into refueling, so the dining room table was dying, and she intuitively knew that couldn't be. So she changed our family in that respect. No microwave, so they couldn't heat up their food at their convenience. And in fact, you had to be there or have a very, very good excuse for evening meal. And my job was to make sure that real conversation happened. That meal usually lasted an hour. Many times, being a competitive family, there would be many books on the table as we argued about who said what, when, and where. People remember those conversations. I meet them. They say, I stayed in your house once for a few days when I was doing some interviewing. But I do remember the conversations. We need to get back to being a genuinely conversing people instead of being only concerned about whether we upset anyone. Truth upsets everyone. We used to learn to deal with it. I mean, if you're an academic, the most petty environment on earth, if you can't deal with somebody saying something that's intending to hurt you, you're in trouble. We've got to learn how to do that again. We used to be able to. I grew up in a working class culture where whatever your hurt was, your dad was likely to say, suck it up, kid, that's what life is like. Stoics, basically, is what the working class used to be because they didn't have any money to fancy enjoyments. So life was straightforward, but it was upright because the only learning they actually got that went into their souls at school was the daily reading of the Bible. Working class kids, by and large, couldn't wait for the end of school. But listening to the Bible every day for anything up to 12 years meant that you remembered it because you couldn't help remembering it. So somebody was talking to me just this week saying they'd come across somebody who'd been in the north of England and was writing about the fact that they couldn't believe how honest they were. In fact, outside London and the big cities, honesty was the norm. It was thought disreputable to do otherwise. The Ten Commandments were never noted as such, but they were known in practice. They were if you like, the word I love, the tacit world, the things that everybody knew were true, although they couldn't explain them. So there was little divorce. The police never visited. The doors were not locked. Being rude to a lady was not acceptable if you were a boy, and your father would imprint that message on your backside if necessary. The guys went for a drink, but we didn't have major problems with drunkenness because people didn't have enough money. It was a safer environment. And books, for me, what made life worthwhile. It made me stand out amongst the working class as other kids couldn't understand why I enjoyed books so much. And I realize now, as I've been traveling around this continent for well over 25 years, staying in homes all over the place, that even people who are in professionals, when I look at the bookshelves in their homes, I feel sad because so many good books are not there. In the background of this film, I didn't put it there, but those books that stand out clearly because of the bright blue and orange thick books, those are all novels by Michael O'Brien. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, if this is sounding strange to you, here's a challenge. Get Michael O'Brien's book, Island of the World, and read it. It's dangerous, so do it in the summer, because once you get into it, it's very difficult to put down. But it will change the way you think. It will change your world significantly. I realized when I first read Michael O'Brien's novels, and I'm pleased to be able to say we know one another because he's been to Augustine College more than twice, and we have corresponded a little bit. And David Jeffrey, who is a good friend of mine, one of the founders of Augustine College, played a major role in getting Michael's work into the general public, and now he has followings around the world. But a few years ago now, when Island of the World had just been published, my wife and I were at a conference in the Rockies. When we got there, we were a bit early, we went for a coffee, and there were friends there. And we said, good to see you. What have you been reading? And all four of us had read this novel, Island of the World. Sally doesn't read many novels. She likes true things. But this novel got under her skin in a big way. And all four of us had the same experience of being reduced to tears and prayer during the reading of that novel, as it challenges our whole way of living in many ways and shows us braver people, imagined, but put in a real context of the Balkans following the Second World War. We have a whole series of stories of people's responses to that. I have a good friend in Jamaica who is now retired, a lovely paediatrician, Kay, and she won't mind me telling this story. I caught her one day reading a trashy, romantic Christian novel. She's a single woman. And I said, Kay, you can do better than that. And she said, like what? Put me in my place. But I said, well, try Island of the World. And she did. And a few weeks later, we got an email, and it said, I'm coming to the end of Island of the World, and I'm slowing down because I don't know what I'm going to do next when I've finished it. What's going to fill that hole? Of course, there's a lot more literature out there. Once you get onto that role, you're going to go on and on. And there's not enough time in life to read everything you want to. But making a space for that, particularly in our children's lives, is important. I mean, if they can't get through everything up to the first degree without being fussed, they shouldn't be pushing in that area. Don't push your children too hard unless they're being lazy. Encourage them and let them find their level and pursue what gives them some real joys. And reading good books is part of that. Reading the Narnia stories to my children was one of the best things I did with them. We all know and love those stories. But he is good is all you need to say in one context. And if you don't understand how that relates to the Narnia stories, you've got a good thing coming to you, because when you read them to your children or your grandchildren or even for yourself, the phrase will come up in a way that will be meaningful forevermore. That's what good literature does. That's why when we used to read a lot of the Bible, stuff sticks in your mind. It forms a matrix, if you like, that catches good things. It's got hooks for good things. And so they stop. And when something is said well, the best thing you can do is write it down and then read what you've written down every now and again. And in due course, it will raise the standard of your own conversation and your own writing. I gave each of my children a quotation book, a commonplace book, some people call it, and that's just as good a name, but a nice book that would go in your pocket, and I would fill the first 20 pages with quotations that I loved and I thought they would love. They all got the habit, especially my son. He had 2 books by the time he went to university and never had an essay to write during his time in the university where he didn't already have a great quotation to get it started. Pay attention to reading, says St. Paul. And it was difficult in those days. There was no printing press, so there's plenty of excuse for not reading. But Paul, when he's in his prison cell, he wants 2 things, something to keep him warm and something to write on. Bring the parchments. Yeah, those were his priorities. We're so different. We have been sucked into a materialistic view of the world, and it's flattened our world out. There's no real excitement. When Harry Potter came along, a lot of people were worried about it because their behaviour was not Christian. Well, of course, it's a novel. The world is not populated dominantly by Christians. I was just delighted that young people were reading and passionately reading, because they're going to move on from that once they've acquired the habit. And even good professors of English liked the Harry Potter stories. One of them, whose name escapes me at the moment, actually flew to London to get an early copy of the last book, and he was willing to say that. So, reading. During the past week with these physicians, that came up time and time again as we shared the things that had helped us and generally celebrated the world, the secondary world, the metaphysical world, whatever you want to call it, that makes our lives better. Our lives are flattened because we don't allow people who can give us a rise space. Let me read to you very briefly. I wasn't intending to do this, but I will. It's a beautiful poem by one of my favourite poets, George Herbert, and it's called The Pulley. Now, of course, I won't be able to find it. Oh, yes, I've got it. He was an Anglican priest, but here's the poem, and it's about us, about you. He says, when God at first made man, having a glass of blessings standing by, let us, said he, pour on him all we can. Let the world's riches, which dispersed lie, contract into a span. So strength first made a way, then beauty flowed, then wisdom, honour, pleasure. When almost all was out, God made us stay, perceiving that alone of all his treasures, rest in the bottom lay. For if I should, said he, bestow this jewel also on my creature, he would adore my gifts instead of me, and rest in nature, not the God of nature. So both should losers be. Yet let him keep the rest, but keep them with repining restlessness. Let him be rich and weary, that at last, if goodness lead him not, yet weariness may toss him to my breast. I love that line. It's descriptive of our world, especially Christians who have stopped at conversion, to live in repining restlessness. And you change that by getting the habit of reading. Well, I will never forget being interviewed by David Stevens just when I was being sucked into a new life I had no idea of. He had come back from turning a one-man hospital into the best teaching hospital in Kenya during about 15 years, and then was persuaded to come back to run the Christian Medical Dental Association of the U.S. And he called me in my office. When I'd adjusted to his accent, he said, I have just listened to a tape of yours several times. I don't usually do that. I said, I don't think so. I don't make tapes. I hide in my office and in my laboratory and write scientific papers. He said, well, you made one. It's your voice. And I couldn't argue with that. I said, what's it called? And he said, The Myth of Moral Neutrality. And I said, well, I have written a brief paper with that title, which was published in a very obscure journal. I didn't know I'd recorded it. He said, well, it's an amateur recording. Somebody recorded in probably an informal setting, but I want a better quality recording. Will you come and record it in the States? And I said, I don't have the budget for that. He said, no, we'll pay for that. So I went down to the States, and I went to a conference and gave, I think, 2 or 3 talks. And then at the end, David said, may I just talk to you for a while with a tape recorder running, because I want to take it back to the staff in the office at CMDA, because I haven't thought about the things you've been talking about at all. So we talked for quite a while, 20, 30 minutes, I guess. At the end, he said, what kind of books have brought you to think in this way? And what I did was sort of just think about my bedside, where there's normally a pile of books, which my wife clears away every now and again, and then I get them out again, but different ones, but some are constant. And so I just listed 6 of them and thought nothing of it. But David's an entrepreneur, and he didn't use that talk just privately. He sent it to 20,000 physicians, because he knew they would want those books, and he arranged that they would have them available, and they got a good deal from the publishers. I can't imagine what the guy at University of Notre Dame Press said when he ordered a few hundred copies of After Virtue, but he did, and he sold them. And that's a hard book to read. The first time I read it, it took me several months. 3rd or 4th time I read it, I picked it up as I went out of the house to catch the plane to South Africa, and by the time I got there, I'd read it. That's what happens with good books, because you're savouring them by the time you're reading the 3rd or 4th time. You know what's coming in many places, and then you realise, oh, it's even better than I thought. I'd not thought of that before. So those books were just 6 of them. For a lot of people, it became a turning point in their lives. I mean, I get teased to this day for what I said on that tape, because at one point I said, well, American physicians are highly intelligent barbarians. David proved me right by saying that they're intellectual barbarians, which is a contradiction in terms. A barbarian is someone who looks upon everybody else's culture as of no value, and their own is fairly thin. They're not barbarians by choice. They're barbarians by dint of what the Faculty of Education has done to our world over the last while. If you want another book to read on that, read Timothy Fuller's Michael Oakeshott on the Human Condition. That's a hard read, but my goodness, it's worth the effort. So doctors come up to me at conferences and saying, you ruined 6 months of my life or a year of my life, and I know what's coming. They're teasing me, but it's fair dues. They're going to tell me that they got those books, and they spent 6 months to a year reading McIntyre's After Virtue, because they say, I'm an obsessive, and so when I start a book, I have to finish it. But they always say, but I have to say, that book, After the Bible, has had a very important impact on me, because that's where the recognition that we were losing an education that produced good people, virtuous people. That idea was really expressed beautifully by MacIntyre in that book, After Virtue. He begins it with a parable. He says, I want you to imagine a know-nothing government taking charge. And that's not difficult for any of us to do these days, no matter where we live. We're ruled by ignoramuses, which is sad. No history, no depth in most cases. And those that do are sidelined. But he says, so I want you to imagine such a government taking over, and it's a very green government, so they decide that all the problems in the world are due to science and scientists, and if we simply get rid of them, the world will become greener and better, and we'll all be nice, noble savages. Of course, it doesn't work that way. And they soon discover the world gets worse, so they have to poke around in the ruins, having lynched the scientists and blown up the laboratories and burned the libraries. There's only ruins left. They poke around and find odd bits of the culture, and they put them together to teach them by rote, just as we teach biochemistry by rote to medical students, 99% of whom forget the lot. Not the way to go, because it's divorced, in MacIntyre's example, from any overarching sense of what science is. And that's true in our world too. Hence we get the scientism of Fauci, who thinks that because he's learned a little bit of science, he's a scientist overall. He has no idea of putting that science into its rightful place within a whole culture. He's destroyed that and destroyed a whole generation of children's lives. And he's utterly unrepentant. Listen to Jay Bhattacharya's interview on the Hoover Institute's podcast, American Ways or something like that. A brilliant account of how that whole thing went wrong. But back to MacIntyre. So he says, what I want you to understand in this book is that that is where we are at the moment, but not in respect of science, but in respect of morality. We have no overarching sense of what it is, and that is disastrous. He then does a very idiosyncratic review of Western philosophical history, but he ends with a brilliant last couple of paragraphs, which go roughly like this, paraphrasing freely. He says, if you have followed my argument, then you will understand that I am proposing that we have already entered upon a second dark ages. But we should not be entirely without hope, because the last time this happened, good men and women withdrew from shoring up the Roman Imperium into the formation of communities within which they could keep the civilities and the virtues alive, and they succeeded. The only difference is last time the barbarians were waiting at the gate, and this time they have been ruling us for quite some time, well over 50 years. He doesn't put that in. We are waiting for a doubtless new St. Benedict. And as on that occasion, what St. Benedict did was preserve learning. In our churches, if there's not a serious reading group, there ought to be. Now, the problem is finding someone to guide you into that. The church I go to now, which I've only been going to for a couple of years, has started an adult reading group, and there are several well-educated people there, but it's lovely to see the level of conversation that's going on that makes coffee time on Sunday morning a lot more interesting, because last Sunday, for instance, one guy, we started talking and he went away, and later that day or the next day I got an email about Roger Scruton, who I had suggested he might enjoy. Think about it. If you don't have any books that you love, you've missed something very important in being a human being. So I hope I've got under your skin. You can find a book list on my website, johnpatrick.ca. It's really a small library. Read what it says at the top. These are books I've actually enjoyed instead of books I'm supposed to have enjoyed. if it's double-spaced and you can read it swiftly, in most cases, you're wasting your time. But not always. I mean, Peter Crave does some quick reads that are well worth the effort, and he's on that list. So the Lord be with you and give you a desire to learn where you come from, because that's one of the things that will come out of it. I just this week showed to one of my grandsons who was at university, I said, just pick up that book over there and read the initial paragraph. It's a history book. But what's in it is a lovely account. He begins his sort of 20th century history. He says, before the First World War, the Englishman's only contact with the government was probably the postmistress or postmaster. And he could go anywhere in the world without the government's consent and without a passport. The world has changed in all sorts of ways. History can help you understand how this came about, what we got right and what we got wrong.